Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History. And I'm your host, Mike Allen. Fredericksburgh. Well, if we're talking about history, we're talking about Fredericksburgh, Virginia, right? After all, there are 4 battlefields from the Revolutionary and Civil Wars there. Well, this time we're talking about Fredericksburgh, New York. And where's that, you might ask? After all, it does not show up on Google Maps because it no longer exists. It's vanished from those maps, and yet the history that occurred there over 3 months in 1778 is going to amaze you. Here to tell us all about it is Bob Riley. He's town historian of Paulding, New York, which replaced Fredericksburgh on the map around 200 years ago. Bob is going to be along in just a moment with incredible tales about that 3-month time period when George Washington and his troops called Fredericksburgh home. This week's trivia question: when the British implemented the hated Stamp Act in the colonies, Connecticut didn't have to pay, thanks to this man. Who was he? Stay tuned after the main program for the answer. You'll have the topic for next week's show. Fredericksburgh. Well, you're not going to find it on any maps that is of New York. In fact, it's challenging to find any information online about this past village. And yet, for nearly 3 months in 1778, George Washington and his troops were there, and an unbelievable amount of important activity took place during the Revolutionary War. Now, the village of Fredericksburgh is in modern-day Dutchess County, New York. Beautiful rural towns of Paulding and Paterson cover the area now. It's a couple miles from Connecticut's western border. It's not too far from West Point in one direction and Long Island Sound in the other direction. And that's one key reason why George Washington was there. Fredericksburgh was in the right place at the right time, a strategic location that checked a lot of boxes for where Washington needed to be for that particular point in time. Well, just a year before that, in 1777, nearby Danbury, Connecticut had been attacked and pillaged by the British, and the only occurrence of the British ever heading inland into Connecticut during the war. They received such stiff resistance when they did it that they didn't ever try it again, and instead stayed along the coastline with their superior navy, ravaging various cities. And yet there was a lot of residual concern that Danbury, which was a key supply depot for the Continental Army, was not well enough defended. And in addition to that, Washington had to be concerned with West Point and keeping the British from controlling the Hudson River, because that would have cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. British Commander Burgoyne was known to be making his way from Canada southward on the Hudson River toward New York City. There he'd meet up with the other British forces and succeed in separating New England from the rest of the young America. And so it was in Fredericksburgh that Washington met with numerous high-ranking officers to lay out the so-called Crescent Strategy for defending that part of the world against the British. But that's really just the start of what he did. Here to tell us about those busy 2.5 months is Bob Riley. He's town historian of Paulding, where the village of Fredericksburgh used to be. So, Bob, let's start off talking about a village that no longer exists. It's off the map, and it's just phenomenal when people hear about Fredericksburgh. They immediately think of Virginia, of course, but this Fredericksburgh, New York, which is in Dutchess County and not too far from the Connecticut border, has an unbelievable 3-month history when George Washington and his troops were in town, and that's what we're going to be talking about. I mean, give people an idea. This is, let's set the stage. 1778, they're coming off the horrible winter in Valley Forge, which was the winter right before this. It's now coming into fall. And one might think that if you're looking for a place for your troops to settle for the winter that's not going to be as cold as Valley Forge, why go north? Why go up into the upper stretches of New York State to a place called Fredericksburgh? Let's start with that. What do you know about why Washington picked that location?
Well, I have an actual quote from General Washington. There are but 2 capital objects which they can have in view except the defeat and dispersion of this army. And then he goes on to the possession of the fortifications of the Highlands, which is over by West Point, between the eastern and southern states would be cut off, and the destruction of the French fleet at Boston. So he didn't know whether he was going to have to move east or west, and Paulding and Fredericksburgh is centrally located. We're just a day or two's march from West Point and 3 days march to Boston. So he was here. It was a holding pattern until he decided where he needed to go. He did confer with his colonels, and some wanted him to read out in New Jersey, some wanted protection of Danbury, and some said, Fredericksburg is a good location. And so he did spread his troops from Reading all the way over to the Hudson River.
And it's interesting because I've heard this called at some time the Crescent Strategy that kind of wrapped around from Long Island Sound to West Point. And this was really critical, right? Because this was now the British were back in New York City and they had to protect everything and keep them from getting up the Hudson River and connecting with the British in Canada. So this was really key, wasn't it?
Right. If the British had succeeded in capturing the Hudson River from New York to Canada, they would have successfully split the colonies in two, making it impossible or very difficult to support both halves.
Now, one of the interesting things that they had been doing were putting these chains across the Hudson River to try and keep the British boats from being able to go up the river. And if my research is right, the first one was put in 1776, right about where the George Washington Bridge is today, and it consisted of logs that were tied together, and that didn't end up working out so well. But I think while Washington was in Fredericksburg, they actually put in the Great Chain, right, from West Point over to Constitution Island. Is that your understanding as well?
Correct, yes, and you can go to West Point and see some of those huge links.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing, and I know they were made in Connecticut and New York, most of the links, I'm pretty sure, right?
There were actually lots of iron mines peppering around this area. In fact, to jump forward 100 years, if I might, much of the iron for the Monitor, the USS Monitor, the ironclad, came from this area.
Wow. Now, when you're talking about controlling the Hudson River between Canada and New York City, obviously you're talking about Lake Champlain and all the activity there. And Fort Ticonderoga, which was key to that, and whoever controlled that controlled the southern end of Lake Champlain. And, of course, there was the famous story where Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen went up and took it from the British without firing a shot, and that was 1775. But in 1777, the British retook it. Can you tell us that story and how that plays into this Fredericksburg situation?
Well, sure. I consider Fort Ticonderoga to be an absolutely awful fort because it was captured 3 times with never a shot having been fired. Major General Philip Schuyler commanded the Northern Department, which included Fort Ticonderoga, Fort Stanwich, and the whole northern Champlain, Lake George area, was preparing to defend for what he called the Saratoga Campaign, which was to cut the colonies in two by splitting New York. And he had complained about the quantity and quality of reinforcements he was receiving. A slightly unfortunate quote, 1/3 of the few that have been sent are boys, aged men, and Negroes. He saw Burgoyne coming down the lake. He was horribly outnumbered, and he and General Arthur St. Clair abandoned the fort in July of 1777. Congress then replaced Philip Schuyler with General Horatio Gates, who was vying for Washington's favor at Schuyler's expense, and so he brought Philip Schuyler up on charges of dereliction of duty and desertion, that his retreat led to the loss of Fort Ticonderoga to the British.
So he brings him up on a court-martial. I guess Schuyler demanded that, and that was there in Fredericksburg, wasn't it?
Well, actually, it was charges of dereliction of duty and desertion. Schuyler demanded the court-martial to answer to the charges. And they were held here in Fredericksburg the beginning of October 1778. Trial lasted 3 days, where he and St. Clair were completely exonerated, returned to full privileges and duties.
Now, this trial took place at a house called the Reed Ferris House, and there was a very famous CBS newsman who ended up living there. Could you tell us that end of the story?
Yes, that would be Edward R. Murrow. We have recordings of him broadcasting during the Blitz of London during World War II. He was one of two very famous broadcasters who lived here in Paulding. The other would be Lowell Thomas, who brought us Lawrence of Arabia.
So now, this 2.5 months that Washington was there, I mean, there's already been enough there. There was the Schuyler situation. He came up with all this strategy, right after Valley Forge and after the attack on Danbury, and really put things together and set up Israel Putnam in command of that area. So there was, a lot on the plate, and things went a lot slower back in the day. And so 2.5 months, you'd say that's enough. But now we're finding out that as he was getting settled there, and he was there from, I think, mid-September into the end of November, and just before he got there, the famous Caleb Brewster, the whaleboater, decided that he might be able to do some spying. Can you pick up that story?
Sure. Caleb Brewster was actually the third attempt at spying on the British in New York City. The first one, most people have to know, was Nathan Hale. I regret that I only have but one life to lose for my country. His spying career lasted just a few hours because he was a soldier and went into New York City supposedly disguised as a Dutch teacher looking for work, and yet he still had with him his Yale diploma and did not change his name. Someone recognized him. He was captured on September 12th and hanged on September 22nd in 1776. In 1777, Washington recruits a Nathaniel Sackett as a civilian, as the perfect spy to infiltrate New York City with a network consisting of agents who were also civilians. Washington gave him $50 per month to recruit others, but he was ineffectual and became ill, and so that kind of petered out. And then Caleb Brewster came in August of 1778 and offered General Washington. Brewster was based in Norwalk, Connecticut, and was able to provide intelligence from across Long Island Sound.
So now Washington, who's at this point settling down in Fredericksburgh, listens to all the pros and cons of setting up what would become the Culper Spy Ring, and then he authorizes it while he's there in Fredericksburg, right?
Yes, he did. The name Culper was suggested by Washington himself as a play on Culpeper County, Virginia, which is where he lived when he was younger. And Caleb Brewster was the transporter between Setauket, Long Island, and Connecticut, where Major Benjamin Talmadge, who was a Setauket-born, would transfer it up to Washington himself in 1778. And the other spies in Setauket were all childhood friends of Caleb Brewster and Benjamin Talmadge. There was also Abraham Woodhull and Anna Strong. They all knew each other their entire lives, and they believed that's what made this such an effective spy ring.
I guess Abraham Woodhull was Samuel Culper Sr., and Robert Townsend was Samuel Culper Jr., and a lot of people learned this from the TV show Turn recently, which is, there's a lot of factual information in there, but they take a little bit of liberty with some of the facts. But nevertheless, it was a great story, and this happens, while Washington is there in Fredericksburg. Now, there was something else that happened when you go back to, as you mentioned earlier, the Battle of Saratoga, that everybody knew at some point was going to happen, that this big confrontation. And this was a huge success for the Patriots. This is what really got the French on board. Benedict Arnold, of course, had a great showing there, which is, people tend to forget he was on our side and doing a good job for a while. But this was October of 1777 when this happened. And now, October 1778, when George Washington is in Fredericksburg with his troops, they decide to celebrate the anniversary of this victory. Tell us that story.
October 1777 was when Burgoyne surrendered, and October 16th of 1778, a council of war was held here at Fredericksburgh, and we had Generals Gates, Greene, DePaul, McDougal, Baron von Steuben, Brigadier General Nixon, Parsons, Smallwood, Knotts, Patterson, Wayne, and Hand were all here at this Council of War. And then the next day, they hosted what some have called the Great Ox Roast or the Great Barbecue. And the artillery were stationed halfway up Quaker Hill in an area that was called Purgatory Hill. And there's some discussion as to who named that. Some believe that it was the artillerymen themselves who maintained that Purgatory Hill was halfway between hell and anywhere else. But that's where they held the Great Barbecue, and Washington led a parade on horseback to Purgatory Hill, and he literally sprang, and this is a quote from some diaries and journals that I have, sprang forward with the swiftness of a bird and ascended by leaps rather than the ordinary gallop. Did I behold so noble an equestrian figure, for General Washington excelled in horsemanship as he did in everything else he undertook. And the barbecue, apparently, in remembrance of Burgoyne's defeat, celebrated with the firing of cannons, the throwing of skyrockets, 13 toasts made to the 13 colonies. At the dinner, there were 350 officers and other gentlemen. And then it says, the evening we retired to town and spent the evening very agreeably. The next day journal entry on the 18th reads just 4 words, we are getting sober.
I just love that. Now, this is enough for a year's worth of activity in the Revolutionary War, all compacted into technically less than a fiscal quarter in time. And I just have one final question on all this. You would think something so memorable that occurred with Fredericksburgh, that Fredericksburgh would be enshrined somehow, and yet it's off the map. It's hard to find any information on it. People like you keep it alive, thank God. And I guess what I'm wondering is, when did it disappear?
Well, I have to believe that it was the railroad, because the railroad actually formed what is now the village of Patterson and the village of Pauling when it came up all the way almost to Albany. And, in 1848, the first train pulled into Pauling. The businesses and housing and all moved closer to the railroad. The coming of the railroad completely changed the economies of eastern Dutchess County. You could now get milk to New York City within a day. So instead of growing pitiful crops on this hilly, rocky soil, much more better to graze cattle on it and dairy farming. And so Fredericksburgh kind of petered out when it was along the Albany Post Road, and Patterson and Pauling moved alongside the railroad tracks.
Today, you'll find a lone single history marker at the intersection of New York routes 22 and 311, showing you where the village center used to be. Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales About History. Now, if you ever do make it up to Pauling, New York, you should know that venerable actor James Earl Jones called it home as well before he passed away, and Bob Riley ended up befriending the famous actor after a chance meeting at the town's recycling center. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Bob Riley, town historian of Pauling, New York. The answer to this week's trivia question: when the British implemented the hated Stamp Act in the colonies, Connecticut didn't have to pay, thanks to this man. Who was he? His name was John Durkee. Next week on Amazing Tales, we'll explore the colonial-era leader in Connecticut who you have probably never heard of before. Yet his activities were of outsized importance in shaping how Connecticut reacted to British rule. You're going to be amazed when you hear it. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe, and stay healthy.